and we're moving on to a new phase of the program. Our next keynote speech will be about the web of data and how we're doing so far. And this will be your first opportunity as well to interact with our speaker. So please do scan that QR code there on the screen. It will take you to Slido and you can join track 1 or track 2. For this plenary session, do join track 1. That's the blue button rather than the red button, which will come up later on. You can also go directly to slido.com on your browser and enter the hashtag Endorse2023. So we are delighted to have joining us live now Elena Simperl, Professor of Computer Science at King's College in London. Elena, I'm going to hand over to you for your keynote speech. Tell us a lot more about the web of data.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction. I am so pleased to be here. I first spoke at Endorse a few years ago. I would love to do this in person one day. I remember at the time, though, how pleased I was to discover a conference that was focusing on the production, management, and sharing of knowledge using open standards, reference metadata, and semantic technologies, which are all things that are very close to my heart. And a bit of context. So I am an ontology engineer by training. I did a PhD in computer science at the Free University of Berlin in 2007. In my PhD, I proposed mechanisms to improve the reusability of ontologies. So in many ways related to the semantic interoperability work that was mentioned in the opening speeches. Also, today, I would call the solution that I came up with back then ontology cards, sort of akin to data and model cards, which are used in machine learning and natural language processing and computer vision to document and share data sets and algorithms and encourage reusability. Linked data, as an idea, emerged around the same time as I was finishing my PhD, so 2006, 2007. And as some of you may know, it was proposing an approach and a technology stack to publish data on the web so it can be accessed and shared and reused by as many applications as possible without knowing ahead what these applications were about. So that vision of the web of data, using the same open, decentralized infrastructure that had made the web a success, has many commonalities with what Endorse is all about. Being able to share and to exchange and to combine data as widely as possible across many application boundaries and breaking some of those data silos. So my talk today asks the following questions. How far did we get in delivering that vision? And I think it's an important question to ask because we are at a critical moment in the history of the web. So I'll give you 3 reasons for this. So first and foremost, it's been now more than 15 years since the idea was first put forward by Tim Berners-Lee, and there's been a lot of investment and enthusiasm and research and development into it. So all these years down the line, it's worth stepping back and reflecting about what went well and what didn't, especially with the current developments that we have heard about a bit earlier about the Interoperability Act and data spaces. Compared to 2006, when the idea emerged, data has become so much more important. Many of our latest technological advances in digital transformation, but also AI and machine learning, depend on access to good, or at least a lot of data. Governments legislate how data should be governed and how it should be published. So we're becoming increasingly aware of the limitations of our data collection and labeling and reporting practices, with consequences for the algorithms, products, and services that use such data. So how does the web of data play into these conversations? And finally, with the advent of deep learning models, with billions and trillions of parameters and multi-million dollar infrastructures to train, there are voices in the tech community, perhaps not at this conference, but definitely in other disciplines. There are voices in the tech community that claim that such models can hold all the information we need. And with tools like ChatGPT, that information is available in an accessible form for everyone, certainly more accessible for most people than an API, than a Jupyter Notebook, SQL, or Sparkle. So is there a role for the web of data in a world where information is not represented in graphs and standardized vocabularies or even spreadsheets, but as parameters and weights of a foundational web AI system? And furthermore, could the experience of ChatGPT, which raced to 100 millions of users in just a few months, could that experience teach us something about the sort of interfaces and experiences we should offer people when they engage with data? Say, the web has definitely shaped our understanding and interactions with data. And there's different ways to think about this. First and foremost, it offers us a way to ask factual questions. So here on the slide, I have an example from a football game from last week. It also allows us to share actual data online for others to use in different ways. So without that question answering interface, perhaps. So we do use spreadsheets and we do share folders in the cloud. We put data on GitHub, and there's many other tools that are facilitated through web platforms that allow us to access other people's data or exchange it with. There's many institutions in government, in science, in cultural heritage that are publishing data for other people to use. There are thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of such initiatives and data sets available. And they do publish them using web technologies for others to be able to find them. There's a huge amount of user-generated data available on the web as well. So there's geodata, like here on the slide, but there's ratings, there's reviews, there's structured knowledge bases like Wikidata and DBpedia and many others. We create digital traces every time we use the web. And these digital traces in websites, in social networks, form the data that keep large parts of the web alive and feed on established business models, advertising business models, and others with consequences that we have all probably learned and talked about. Those who have access to data are today at an advantage when developing or deploying algorithms, in particular in artificial intelligence. In this context, a lot of progress in machine learning is really due to having access to web data. It is estimated, for instance, that ChatGPT is trained, or that the training data that ChatGPT uses is up to 3% data from Wikipedia. Stable Diffusion, which is a model that generates images rather than text, is trained on the Common Crawl dataset, which includes, among other things, Flickr. So this raises very interesting questions about how open and participatory data projects facilitated by the web should be funded, and about the fair use of this data in downstream applications. Another hugely important reason why these algorithms become smarter and smarter is human feedback, for instance, in reinforcement learning or in supervised learning and machine learning. So that human feedback could be implicit. For instance, when I download a dataset from a web portal, that could be understood as a signal that that dataset is relevant to my query. Or explicit in the form of labels. Like here, for instance, it's an example of a project in digital humanities called Old Weather, where volunteers are helping scientists in labeling, in annotating old logs of weather observations to train machine learning algorithms. The web was meant to bring all these different types of data sets and data sources together in the same way that it connects regular digital resources or web documents. Some of the data would be openly available. Some would be shared only with trust parties. Some would be made accessible to third parties for a fee. And the main components of this giant graph of data would be modeled after the web itself. So we're talking about identifiers, we're talking about links between them that are typed, we're talking about metadata, shared vocabulary, services to read and write this data, and so on. In that regard, the web of data is very much related to another web you know very well, which is the semantic web. And ultimately, both subscribe to this vision that intelligence, as in artificial intelligence, or machine intelligence, emerges from knowledge or from the ability to encode knowledge in a domain in a machine-readable form. And that encoding is, for practical reasons, realized in a decentralized graph. And the web of data addresses one part of this vision, namely that of accessing and integrating data across publishers. There are people who have questioned the feasibility of this concept. I personally don't. I think there's many examples in life sciences, in humanities, in government that already went well beyond feasibility. And at this conference, for instance, there's many successful applications that make a strong case for some elements of the web of data architecture. The only question I'm asking in this talk is, how far did we get with the big vision, and how sustainable is it? Let me just check for time. Okay, we're not doing very badly. And my answer is, in short, is as follows. Well, the theory and practice of the web are not the same, but why? Well, there's a lot of data on the web, and some of it is more webby than others, so published according to certain guidance and architectural principles and standards. There aren't many links between data sets, but publishers do make an effort to provide metadata of reasonable quality, in some cases following referenced or standardized vocabularies. The idea that the web of data is only about linked data, or even about linked open data, I think that needs to go away for good, and instead we can and should and are in fact iterating. And we should do more to learn from the experiences we made with that particular technology stack and with related standards to understand what worked and what didn't. This may mean going back to the underlying architecture, question whether the web could ever do for data what it does for other digital resources and services. I personally think the analogy web of documents, web of data is not universally helpful because it assumes people, organizations publish data on the web for the same reasons as when they publish websites, when they put information online, and that they search for data sets to meet the same sort of goals as when they search for information. And we know by now that that's not the case. Well, let's look at some of these components in greater detail. Say the web stands for a mix of different platforms and services, and the web of data is equally diverse. So I'm talking here about the web of data in practice rather than theory. So the theory was this technology-centric concept, which came with a certain way to publish resources and to access them using standards like W3C standards, like the resource description framework and the RDF schema, Sparkle, and so on. Undoubtedly, we came quite a long way since the first linked open data cloud was published in 2007. I think it had around 10, 12 data sets. So the latest release in 2022 has more than 1,500 data sets. That's much more, but considering the time frame that we're talking about, I don't think it is a great result, especially as progress has really slowed down down the years. And there's been a lot of discussion in the linked data community about decentralized architectures to access and manage this data effectively, and about the quality of the data in the graph, and about the role of Sparkle, about how to combine web APIs with linked data, including some solutions presented at this conference. But personally, I think there's two bigger issues, and that these two issues are interrelated. The first is that there are very few business cases for creating and maintaining links. And links are one, if not the magic ingredient of the web. And second is about the costs associated with using linked data versus its benefits compared to other technologies. The evidence we have, or we don't, about these costs and benefits is quite patchy. And there's also a question of how that cost benefits formula applies to different types of publishers with different levels of resources and technical maturity. I'm going to give you an example from government. So this is a domain, as you have heard earlier, that tends to be super linked data friendly, at least in Europe. So this is a subcloud of the 2022 Linked Open Data Cloud. So you can see here at a glance that, at least in terms of links, there are some biases towards certain types of data, like country codes and statistics, and perhaps some environmental data, and that some countries do more linked data than others. And I'll return to this in a short while. So most of the work I've done in open government data for more than 10 years now has been in the context of data.europa.eu. So I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about, but if not, this is one of the largest public investments into open government data, if not the largest investment in the whole world. So the idea is to provide uniform access to open government data sets alongside resources and support on the back of the Public Sector Information Directive, now the Open Data Directive, which was published latest, I think, in 2019. So in data.europa.eu, we have a network of distributed data providers, all with their own legislation and local data strategies. And the portal harvests metadata about these providers. So there's more than 170 data catalogs, which add up to around 1.6 million data sets spread across 36 different countries. Now, if you're a data consumer or a data user, you can do dataset search, as you can see here in the middle of the slide. For instance, you can use a search box like you would do in a regular search engine, or you could also specify details on format and other metadata categories using facets. At the same time, you can also learn about how the data is used. And as a publisher, you have a whole range of tools and methods to improve the quality of your metadata and learn how to go about understanding how the data that you've published with so much effort is used and what impact it has in downstream applications. There's also quite a few interesting tools. I would encourage you to have a look about the evolution of publishing over time across different domains and catalogs and countries. All this is underpinned by a set of technology that you're probably very familiar with. So we're talking about datasets described using the DCAT AP standard. We're talking about triple store. We're talking about Sparkle access. We're even talking about data citation. So a shout out to the team at the publication office and DigiConnect for this unbelievable achievement. Now, in addition to all the nice tech, we also have many different resources that I'd encourage you to have a look at. My favorite is the collection of more than 900 use cases of using open government data across many different countries. And in particular, the work that was done by colleagues in the data.europa.eu team called the Use Case Observatory, where they have taken 30 of these use cases and have analyzed them in depth, monitored and analyzed them in depth over 3 years to get a deeper understanding of open data use and impact. My small contribution to this fantastic initiative has been in the area of how to make data publishing efforts more sustainable. And I'm going to talk about this a lot in this presentation. But the short answer is publish with the user in mind and publish with the help of the user. And the way we came to these conclusions is by doing a whole range of observational studies where we've actually looked at the status quo, which allowed us to write recommendations and guidance for publishers. We've also done some software development and prototyping to explore different, more decentralized, more user-centric portal architectures. We've also done work into implementing algorithms for dataset recommendations and much more. So today, and for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to walk you through some of these works. And I'm going to start with a study that we have published in 2019 at the International Semantic Web Conference. And this was about the adoption and quality of linked data in what was back then called the European Data Portal. So this was 4 years ago. So the analysis was based on around 1 million data sets that EDP was indexing at the time, which all used DCAT to describe the data. And the study had 2 parts, the actual linked data and then the linked metadata, which accompanies the data sets. The message from this analysis was loud and clear. So after tens of millions of euros of investment in different parts of Europe at local level, linked data is still not widely used. And when given a choice, public authorities don't use it. The government LOD cloud that I've shown earlier had some data sets, I think from the Czech Republic, from Greece, from the UK. On data.europa.eu, linked data is used in Italy, in Spain, and in Greece. But even then, vocabularies are not dereferenceable, which is one key aspect of the linked data stack. At the same time, there is evidence that some elements of the linked data idea seem more useful or used than others. And we're talking about identifiers, we're talking about metadata vocabularies. In fact, we see these in use not just in open settings on the open web, but also in industry in their own internal project. In our study, the quality of the metadata was overall quite good. There was some room for improvement. The issue was really with vocabulary reuse, with the very few exceptions. So maybe legislation will help down the road, but in the study that we have done in 2019 on those linked data sets, we found thousands of proprietary vocabularies, sometimes within the same national legislation. And as I said, the fewest of these vocabularies could be dereferenced. And perhaps the situation has improved somewhat in the meantime, but progress does tend to be quite slow. So what do we make of these results? Excuse me, let me just have a sip of water. Well, in my view, government publishes data because, or public authorities publish data because there is a law that mandates it. This is obviously oversimplified, but I know there are other reasons. So what is the case, the business case, or the rationale for making someone's schema easy to reuse by others? Maybe it should be mandated more broadly, as the speakers before me have alluded to. And if those mandates are in place, how should publishers be supported in adopting those vocabularies? And I think the Web of Data gives us some lessons for how this could be done. At the same time, beyond publishing, we need to think about what do the users of these online datasets really need? And when do they need integration across a number of different data sites? When is that a huge priority for them? What sort of institutions, what sort of businesses, what sort of contexts require this level of harmonization and technical sophistication? If that's less of a concern, then there's very few reasons why certain publishers would want to spend time creating and managing and adopting some of those vocabularies, or even more so, putting those efforts to create and manage links. I'm not contesting linked data can bring huge advantages, especially if there is organizational buy-in, like it is the case here at the publication office. But the data we have and the experience that we have from working with these 170 data catalogs in data.europa.eu and with many other, often smaller publishers, is that the benefits don't always outweigh the costs. Say, we need to think about supporting those sort of publishers and thinking about the users as well. So this is an example where a data standard can make a huge difference. It is a project in the UK called Open Active. The setting is as follows. So the publishers in this case are small organizations. So we're not talking about public authorities. We're talking about still publicly funded or mixed funded organizations that run sports facilities or events. So the Open Data Institute in the UK has worked with 69 such data publishers and with them developed a standard to share data about events, so physical and online sports sessions, about facilities, for instance, swimming pools, about routes and accessibility requirements. Publishers that we're talking about here are not at the level that we're indexing in data.europa.eu. So they are the sort of small local facilities that are offering space, they're offering sports activities to their local communities. Crucially, however, publishing the data with this standard enables them to get more bookings through third-party sites. So there is a clear incentive for them to get on board and put the effort to take the data and, first of all, digitize the whole process, but also use this standard as part of the digitization. Also crucially, so besides the fact that there is an incentive, the standard comes with a set of tools and resources that supports these publishers to understand the business case, to improve the data, to improve the metadata, for those who are up to it to implement an API, to think about licenses, and so on. So here you have a business case where there's a network of organizations that come together to agree on the standard that allows them to run their businesses better and to reach economies of scale that they would otherwise not reach on their own. There's a very interesting report that has just come up now from My Society that is looking at unlocking the value of fragmented public data and provides lots of these examples where these sort of standards have developed. I'm not going to have time to go through it in a lot of detail, but two interesting points there. So if we go back to linked data, which underpins this whole web of data idea, at least originally, in those 900 use cases from the data.europa.eu collection, only 2 mention linked data explicitly. So that tells us something. And I think one of the reasons is, and this report from My Society makes that case quite compellingly, is that it's in the way that the technology was presented and some of the initial projects were rolled out. And one of the things they provide as an alternative is this alternative way to take the 5-star scheme that linked data offered and redefine it, but redefine it in a way that focuses less on the sort of technology competence or level of technical sophistication, and more in terms of the added value that each of these layers adds to solve an actual problem. So we've seen so far that linked data is used in some parts of the web, but not in others, and regulation and investment may push the needle in the right direction, but ultimately this is a question of having a business case for integration and against silos and fragmentation. So how about the rest of the web? Well, the web, it turns out, is full of data sets. So Google have launched their dataset search tool a few years ago. As of really very recently, datasets are also integrated with the regular search engine, as you see here in my football example. So according to the designers, they have 45 million data sets that are using DCAT and schema.org from 20, I think, or 25 million in 2020. And the fact that now this is all integrated with the regular search engine also is quite an interesting development, because basically it means that they will get lots of that implicit feedback, human feedback and exposure to improve on some of those dataset retrieval algorithms that they use. Now, beyond that, there's even more data. So 45 million is better than the 1,500 linked open datasets in the cloud, but it's still a subset. So this is another project I'm very, very fond of, which is the Web Data Commons. So that's a project supported, among others, by the team of Chris Bitzer, one of the authors of the original linked data paper at the University of Mannheim. So if you look here, they look at the common crawl dataset, and they extract the resources, the HTML pages that have data in JSON LD, microformats, RDFA, and so on. And the results are actually quite compelling. So almost half of the pages in the common crawl have this sort of data of markup. We're talking sort of more than 14 million what they call pay-level domains, or I would call them publishers. Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it shows that in some domains, publishers do think that it is worth the effort to annotate their pages with structured data. The engagement in defining those vocabularies, in this case schema.org, may be uneven, but there are channels to suggest changes if one needs them. So the point is that the incentives are aligned. And then the other thing that is interesting for me is that is the sort of data and the domains that publishers think are useful enough. So products, people, local businesses, job postings, question and answers, and events. And it'd be very interesting to see a study into these publishers and the specific use and misuse of vocabularies that could inform the design of shared vocabularies in the future. And also, perhaps as a follow-up, a study that would try to articulate, would try to quantify the value of the shared vocabulary for individual publishers and for the ecosystem. So some of the work we've been doing in data.europa.eu is around helping publishers to think about their processes and portals in a user-centric way. So this is work that is already quite old, from 2017, where we came up with 10 principles for designing portals in a user-centric way. I'm not going to have the time to go through them in the detail, but there's a report on the data.europa.eu website that talks about them. What we've also done is we've tried to operationalize these 10 guidelines. So we went from the 10 high-level commands, so to speak, and tried to develop these 5-star schemes to make them more actionable. So as an example here, if we're looking at organize for use, one of the principles, we then went from level 1 to level 5 and tried to articulate the benefit to put that extra effort to reach that level. There's another one for collocate documentation, so put the documentation where the data is. And then we went and did a study with 10 portals that were all using CCAN, just to be able to compare them. These portals were not chosen to create a ranking of any sort, but really they were chosen so that they they are at different stages in their open data maturity journey. And we wanted to understand, are any of these principles inherently hard? And they are. So be discoverable, collocate documentation, and be measurable tend to be universally challenging. Again, another shout out at the data.europa.eu team who are implementing already many of these principles around user-centric design, though to be honest, some the work around measuring impact and use is still quite challenging, especially when it comes to bridging the gap between sort of low-level engagement indicators and a real evidence of impact. Okay, so how much time do I have? Good. So we've talked about helping publishers understand what user needs, and thinking about designing their portals in a way that focuses more on how the consumers and the users are going to want to find and make sense of that data, and less on reflecting publishing practices. So in a next step, we wanted to understand a little bit whether some of the guidance that is available to publishers in the literature around publishing the data in an accessible way is backed by actual evidence. So we moved away from data portals or data repositories to other places on the web where people put their data. And with the same sort of user-centric questions in mind, we wanted to see, can we link some of these principles, for instance, around FAIR, so findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability, from data management, can we link those to evidence that implementing that guidance leads to more people using those data sets? So this was joint work that was done with the team at the University of Amsterdam around Paul Gross. So what did we do? We first did a literature review and we found around 40 papers and almost as many potential reuse vectors for datasets. And we put those together in a number of coherent guidelines for publishers. So all these guidelines basically say, what should you do as a publisher if you want your data to be more reusable in theory? And then we wanted to provide the evidence that implementing some of this guidance works and is useful. So to do that, we needed to have a platform where we could measure a few things, and that platform was GitHub. So we looked at GitHub almost as a data platform, so to speak, and we had access to a corpus of 1.4 million datasets, mostly CSV and Excel spreadsheets, and 65,000 publishers. And then essentially we took that guidance from those 40 papers and we mapped those literature features to observable features on GitHub, both dataset and repositories of publisher features. And then we've used engagement metrics in GitHub as proxies for data reuse. And we wanted to see if there's correlations between publishers who tend to implement some of that guidance, for instance, documentation, for instance, information about quality, for instance, being detailed about the data attributes, and more or less engagement. Say, we came up with some recommendations, and we had data to back that principles like collocate documentation and tools really lead to more popular repositories and datasets. Now, if you move away from publishers, let's finally look at the users. Say we have many datasets on the web, some of them openly available. Can people actually find the data they need? And I have here some screenshots of my own little experience in trying to find football data online and in the UK in particular. But we've done a few studies over the years in dataset retrieval to understand the performance of dataset search algorithms and to understand user behavior in dataset search. The first one was an analysis of logs and data requests over 4 portals in 2018 that basically showed that searches tend to be explorative, that most queries have some sort of temporal and location element to them, and that there's 2 types of users, depending on where that data journey starts. And this was confirmed in a bigger analysis of logs of data.europa.eu, where we essentially showed not just that lots of these queries tend to refer to some of those attributes in the metadata that's used to describe datasets, but also, for instance, that echoing some of the findings from the GitHub study, that the dataset preview page is important for certain types of search sessions, and that linking to stories and other resources helps with traffic as well. And from that, we've identified a number of recommendations from publishers as well, in particular around the typology of users and the optimizations that they would need to do for certain types of queries and linkage to other resources. Every study so far basically showed results presentation is important. So then my final study for today is a study we've done into understanding how those results, the dataset results, should be presented to people for them to be convinced and have confidence that a dataset that they find on a portal is relevant to them. One of these studies focused on what it means to write good text snippets about data as well, because lots of our users, especially when they don't have a technical background, tell us that metadata records are not exactly their favorite way to understand how a dataset is used. So to conclude, I think we're at a crucial moment in data availability and use, online and elsewhere, and there's a lot of body of evidence, and I've presented some of it, about what people need in terms of data and how the data is published on the web and why. We don't have lots of links, and we don't always have great business cases for creating and maintaining them. In fact, I think with the rise of generative AI, we need to rethink business models for open data over time anyway. We've also seen examples of how standards emerge and how they are adopted and can be adopted when they solve a real problem. Echoing some of the earlier speakers, I think technology can help rather than hinder and should never, ever take the central stage. So there's many things that remain to be done, and I've picked 3 of them to conclude. The first is around bringing users more involved into maintaining and documenting data sets. And here, I think there's a lot that we can learn also from the machine learning community that have developed platforms and formats for how this can happen. My second future work direction that I want to leave you with is around the digital divide. So yes, we have lots of data, but some data is really missing. So one of the work we've done a few years ago is on open government data for rural areas, and there the digital divide is more present than ever. So I do wonder, in all this conversation about high value data sets and the granularity and the coverage that they need to have, will this mean that we can close that digital divide in data set publishing? Or will it actually draw investment towards certain domains that tend to be more relevant in urban areas? And finally, we talked a lot about the fact that linked data is too hard to learn and to adopt, but we do have now AI tools that can write computer code and Sparkle queries based on natural language prompts. And there's also some evidence that one could use prompting and recursive prompting to support data search and sense making. So on the slide, I don't know if you can read it, but I put screenshots of a small experiment I have done where I basically replicated the way we know people search for data online or on data portals. And so far, it seems that a tool like ChatGPT can work surprisingly well in telling people things about data sets that are published online. So I find this very interesting, so I'm writing a paper about it. Ultimately, I would like us as a community to think about all these issues in a user-centric way and to look for evidence for everything that we do, because I think that's the only way the world of data can stay relevant. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Southampton, at Amsterdam, at Capgemini and the Open Data Institute for their help, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Elena. You covered a lot of ground, and you posed some questions as well that I hope our audience will be able to think about over the coming days. But we have had this Slido open, so people have been posting questions to you, and we've just a few minutes, so I'm going to start straight away. First question that's come in is there a difference between the efficacy of publishing shared vocabularies and publishing classic data like statistical, sensor, or product data sets? What's the difference there?
So just to follow up, did you say efficacy?
Yes.
And so sort of effort, yeah. Yes, definitely. There's a a difference. So there's a different difference in effort for every organization. Those who are familiar with standard will be able to use it more effectively. Those who need to learn or perhaps take data that is published in a different format and harmonize it will need tool support, will need training to be able to do that. I think there's definitely a difference. At the same time, I think, at least in my field, and I do come from this shared vocabularies ontologies field, there's a lot of experience by now in what it takes to pick up those publisher communities and support them with technical tools, with resources, with business cases, to make some of that journey easier.
Another question is, where do you see the role of citizen-generated data sets in the web of data? I know this is something that was always going to come up. And what about technologies for personal information management? What about the role there of less formal sets?
Okay. So these are they're very interesting issues. So lots of the data sets that I have spoken about in this presentation, lots of the data sets that are indexed on platforms like dataeuropa.eu are published by official sources, and there are advantages to them, and they offer certain types of guarantees to users and so on and so forth. There are areas where, however, citizen generated data sets can provide advantages. So the area I work in most actively is environmental data or transport data sets, where perhaps for public authorities, it is a big investment to create a data set like that and keep it up to date year to year. Instead, if we're using digital devices and cheap sensors, we could perhaps recreate or create a complementary data set that the public authority could use. But there's many challenges around that. You tend to have better coverage, geographic, geospatial coverage in some areas, but you also challenges around noisy data, around the quality of the data set that you create by aggregating all these citizen inputs. Having said that, I think there's a huge opportunity, and there's in Europe and elsewhere lots of citizen science initiatives that come up with data sets that could be used in addition to what we know and can find on open government data portals. And I think the second question was around personal information. So in everything that I have said, I implicitly assumed that an organization will put or an individual will put a data set online, but that data set is there because there's a requirement for that data set to be published, or because the organization has an interest in publishing that data to advertise what they're doing. So with personal information, this is very different. And in fact, if we go back to the original web of data idea from Tim Berners-Lee, just like everyone can put a page online, you should also be able to publish whatever spreadsheets you might have that you think other people might be interested in an easy way. I think there is a whole conversation around who has control and who can manage our own personal data. So data that we are creating, those digital traces that I mentioned in my presentation. And the development that I know of, that probably some of the attendees will know as well, is an initiative started by Tim Berners-Lee as well, called SOLID, which is around the standard to take decentralized data publishing at an extreme, and allow individual small businesses to publish their data in a way that goes across different data silos in pods that give them control and autonomy and decision power over who and how that data is used. So I think if we're comparing that sort of an architecture with what portals are doing at the moment. They're very different sides of the same story. So it would be very interesting to understand how access to those hugely decentralized networks could look like.
Well, we've got a few more questions, so we'll try and get through a couple of them quickly. How do we make a stronger case for interoperability and against fragmentation? I mean, that's such a broad
Yes.
question that I know it's a challenge to answer it
Yes.
quickly.
So I can offer two short answers. One, I think, like in the example with Open Active, there's many other examples in that My Society report I had on my slides, by the way. If there is a business case, if publishers don't have a standard to publish data, but if there are third parties that would benefit from different publishers creating their data in the same way, like it was in Open Active. So every swimming pool wants to have more bookings, and the way to achieve that wasn't by them opening. Well, they can have a booking system on their own web page, but that doesn't have a lot of traffic. The traffic comes from third-party sites, and those third-party sites would not want to work with 69 swimming pools, all publishing data in different formats. So in that case, because they wanted to have that leverage to get more bookings through third-party providers and intermediaries, there was a clear business case for that standard to emerge. So that a business case is crucial, I think. Also, legislation is crucial, and we've heard about the Interoperability Act. I think in those cases, it's really paramount to make sure that we don't design solutions just for large government institutions and for large metropolitan areas to publish data, but also think across the spectrum for some of the smaller publishers and NGOs.
Well, finally, we've got a question from Felicitas Lofer asking about the core vocabularies of the EU and saying what other terminologies are available for public institutions for describing data and services properly, for example, 5 stars. What sort of ratings or terminologies we might see?
It's not an area I have done research very recently, I have to say. So I'm sure there will be lots of presentations at the conference today, tomorrow about some of these things. So I think the one rating system I know of is from the Open Data Institute. It's called the Open Data Certificate. I think the metadata quality methodology that the dataeuropa.eu project or platform is implementing is also a good starting point just to think about measuring some of those things. Now, in terms of vocabularies, there's many in different domains, and there's also generic ways to describe data sets if what you're interested in is having your data, making your data more visible and picked up by search tools and harvesters like dataeuropa.eu or Google Dataset Search. I think it's quite a broad question. So in every vertical, you'd probably be able to find examples.
Well, I'm going to try and ask you, Elena, for a one-word answer to this last question, since it's been there for a moment or two. How do we estimate if we've reached the breakthrough in published data? Is there a critical point? Is there a eureka moment that you think is possible, or is that something just to keep an eye on?
I think we are a little bit in a critical situation because there is a bit of open data fatigue that I'm observing. So that means that investment may go in other directions, and the data sets that we have at the moment may not be maintained so well as they have been before, and then lots of the great work that has been done so far will not be wasted, but will not have the impact that it could have. So I think for me that's almost a bigger challenge at the moment.
Well, Elena, thank you very much. It's been hugely insightful. Thank you to our audience for sending in those questions. I know we didn't have time to get to all of them, but we will try to get to them over the next few days. Thank you very much again, Elena.